She was the face that defined an era. Fierce on the runway, untouchable in the gloss of magazine covers. They called her the first supermodel of the 1980s, a woman who could sell fantasy with a single glance. Yet behind the flashbulbs, she was chasing something far darker than fame. The cameras had stopped clicking. The phones had stopped ringing. All that remained was the echo of a girl who had flown too close to the sun. This is the untold story of Gia Carangi. Before the darkness claimed her, Gia Carangi was a comet tearing across the fashion sky, brief, blazing, and impossible to ignore. Born in Philadelphia in 1960, Gia Marie Carangi was not the conventional debutante of high fashion. She was raw, wild, and unapologetically herself. In an era still dominated by polished, all-American beauties. And eyes that dared the camera to look away. Her rise was meteoric. In 1978, barely 18, she was spotted by modeling scouts and whisked into the orbit of New York's elite agencies. From there, the transformation was instant. Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar wanted her on their covers. Fashion houses from Armani to Dior competed for her presence on their runways. She was the muse every photographer longed to shoot, not because she followed the rules, but because she seemed genetically incapable of them. Gia's photographs were electric. She didn't just wear the clothes, she inhabited them. Draped in silk or leather, she could look both fragile and dangerous in a single frame. Behind the lens of legendary photographers like Francesco Scavollo and Arthur Elgort, she became an icon before the term supermodel even existed. The press adored her. Designers raved about her instincts. She had the ability to understand the camera, not just pose for it. But what set her apart was more than beauty. Gia brought an edge that the industry didn't know it needed. She had tattoos at a time when they were taboo in high fashion. She strutted into shoots with short cropped hair one week and long windswept locks the next. She laughed too loud, smoked too much, and never apologized for either. In a world obsessed with perfection, she made imperfection alluring. On the catwalk, she was untouchable. She walked with a predatory grace, slow, deliberate, each step a statement. Backstage, she was magnetic, pulling other models into her orbit with a mix of confidence and vulnerability. Everyone wanted to be near Gia, not just because she was beautiful, but because she seemed to know some secret about life that others didn't. Magazines painted her as a new kind of American beauty, rebellious yet glamorous, tough yet tender. Articles called her the next big thing, the girl who will change fashion forever. For the public, she was the embodiment of freedom and style. A woman who had escaped the ordinary and ascended into the rarefied air of global fame. To millions of readers flipping through glossy spreads, Gia Carangi was untouchable, the ultimate dream. The power to command a room simply by walking into it. Yet beneath the surface, there were already cracks. Friends would later recall moments when her eyes, even at the height of her success, seemed to flicker with something darker, an ache that the spotlight could not erase. But to the public, those shadows were invisible. They only saw the legend in the making. And how tragically, that face would disappear. Long before she was draped in couture and immortalized on glossy covers, Gia Carangi was just a restless girl from Philadelphia. Born into a home that looked perfect from the outside but was fractured at its core. Her father, Joseph, owned a restaurant. Her mother, Kathleen, was a homemaker with a taste for the finer things. Moving out and taking little more than her clothes, leaving her children to navigate the emotional wreckage. Gia never fully recovered from that departure. In interviews years later, especially older women who reminded her of what she'd lost, she would later gravitate toward relationships that echoed that abandonment, passionate, intense, but ultimately unstable. As a teenager, she was a misfit. At Abraham Lincoln High School, Gia wasn't the prom queen type, she was the girl hanging out with the art students, the musicians. The kids who lingered at the edges of the cafeteria. She discovered David Bowie's music and made him her personal deity. She painted a lightning bolt on her face, wore men's jackets. She learned the intoxicating power of being seen, of walking into a room and pulling all eyes toward her. But she also learned about escape. The kind found in a line of powder or a shared cigarette laced with something stronger. Drugs weren't yet a habit, but they were becoming a language she understood. Her relationship with her mother remained strained. Kathleen's visits were sporadic, often awkward, and never long enough to bridge the years of distance. Her father provided for her materially but seemed ill-equipped to deal with the emotional turbulence of a teenage daughter. Gia's siblings were busy with their own lives, leaving her to drift between households, never truly anchored in either. When a local photographer approached her in her late teens, suggesting she try modeling, it felt like a ticket out. She was posing for test shots in Philadelphia and hopping buses to New York for go-sees. But even as the fashion world began to open its doors, the ghosts of her past followed. Stylists, other young models, and when those bonds fractured, she turned to drugs to numb the ache. Gia's vulnerability was easy to miss under her bravado. In early interviews, she played the role of the streetwise up-and-comer, tossing off sarcastic one-liners and puffing on cigarettes like she'd been born in a smoke-filled loft. But friends recall late-night phone calls where her voice was small, trembling, asking if they still cared about her, if they would be there when she needed them. The industry that would soon crown her its queen had no idea that the same wild energy that made her magnetic on camera came from a place of instability. Gia had learned to perform confidence the way others performed a runway walk, with precision, with flair, and with a quiet desperation that no one noticed until it was too late. The cracks in her foundation were already there, invisible under the glitter of her early career. But as the spotlight grew hotter, those cracks would widen. And the girl who once found salvation in the lens of a camera would begin to lose herself in the shadows. When Gia arrived in New York for good, she wasn't yet the legend she would become. She was a 19-year-old with an unpolished walk, a Philadelphia accent, and a closet that held more Bowie t-shirts than designer dresses. But in the hands of Wilhelmina Cooper, the modeling world's most influential agent at the time, Gia was about to be transformed. Wilhelmina didn't just sign models, she sculpted them. She saw Gia's potential instantly, the raw, feral beauty that the camera devoured. She set about refining her, arranging the right shoots, introducing her to elite designers, guiding her through the politics of the industry. Gia's leather jackets were swapped for haute couture gowns. Her smudged eyeliner was perfected into smoky eyes that hypnotized onlookers. She wasn't just a girl from Philly anymore, she was Gia. A single-name brand that could command thousands of dollars a day. The transformation was intoxicating. In a matter of months, Gia went from anonymous casting calls to the front row of Studio 54, where fame and decadence intertwined like cigarette smoke and disco lights. There, she mingled with Andy Warhol, Grace Jones, and a rotating cast of glittering celebrities. The club became her second home, a place where no one cared about her fractured childhood or insecurities, only about how she looked under the strobe lights. But reinvention came with its compromises. Gia learned quickly that in modeling, survival often meant surrender. She became adept at projecting whatever version of herself the client wanted. For a Paris shoot, she was the sultry temptress in velvet. For an American department store campaign, she was the girl next door with a knowing smile. The real Gia, the one who cursed like a dockworker and chain-smoked through fittings, was tucked away, brought out only for the inner circle she trusted. Her allure was partly in that duality. But with the reinvention came an unspoken pressure to maintain the illusion, even when she was exhausted or unhappy. Modeling was not just a job, it was a performance she had to deliver on command. Yet with the rise came cracks in her carefully constructed image. The parties got wilder. The lines of cocaine in the Studio 54 bathrooms became longer. Her flirtation with heroin. And as long as she delivered in front of the camera, her off-hours chaos was tolerated. But heroin began to creep into her shoots. She would show up late, eyes glassy. But it came at the cost of her authenticity. Gia, the rebellious Philly girl, was now a curated fantasy, one that required constant upkeep and a dangerous cocktail of substances to sustain. The persona was feeding the career, but it was also feeding the addiction. Wilhelmina, who had been her mentor and anchor, died of lung cancer in 1980. The loss was devastating. Without her, Gia drifted, both professionally and personally. She signed with other agencies, but none had the same protective influence. Without Wilhelmina's steady hand. By 1981, Gia Carangi had reached a pinnacle few models of her generation could touch. She was on the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan within the same month, fronting campaigns for Versace, Dior, and Yves Saint Laurent. Her face was plastered on billboards in Paris and New York, and designers fought over her availability like she was a rare jewel. At just 21, she was earning thousands of dollars per day, photographed by the greatest names in fashion, and cementing her place as the model who redefined the look of the decade. On the runway, she was pure electricity. Every step was a calculated seduction, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed on the audience as though she was letting them in on a secret. In photographs, she was a chameleon. Sultry and defiant for Francesco Scavollo, ethereal and aloof for Arthur Elgort. She could embody contradictions, a hardened streetwise edge wrapped in soft glamour, and make it look effortless. But behind the camera's flash, the life fueling her image was burning out. Heroin had shifted from being a weekend indulgence to a daily necessity. Mornings began with a fix, nights ended with one. And clients quietly began removing her from campaigns. Fashion's memory was short, there was always another girl, younger and cleaner, ready to take her place. Her personal life was just as turbulent. Gia craved intimacy but often sought it in the wrong places, brief, intense romances with women who couldn't anchor her through her spiraling habits. One of her most famous relationships with makeup artist Sandy Linter was as passionate as it was volatile, with arguments that matched the intensity of their affection. When those relationships fractured, Gia was left adrift. Her loneliness amplified by the emptiness of hotel rooms in foreign cities. Still, there were moments when the old magic flickered. In late 1981, she posed for a Vogue spread that would become one of her most memorable, swathed in silk, her eyes piercing the camera, as though daring the world to forget her. But the control she once wielded over her career was slipping. Some designers, wary of her reliability, quietly blacklisted her. Jobs grew fewer. The girl who had been everywhere was now conspicuously absent. The drugs took a heavier toll. Friends would recall finding her slumped in corners at parties. Her once animated voice reduced to a murmur. Studio staff whispered about track marks on her arms, hastily covered with makeup or long sleeves. Even in photographs, the transformation was visible. The sparkle in her eyes dulled, the confident smirk replaced by something more distant, almost hollow. By 1982, Gia's career was in freefall. She attempted rehab multiple times, checking into clinics with promises to get clean, but the pull of the high, and the environment she inhabited, proved stronger. Each attempt at sobriety was followed by a relapse. Every whispered rumor about needles and midnight runs to dealers. Gia had reached the top of her world, but the cost was everything that had once grounded her, her health, her career. By the mid-1980s, the girl who had once defined beauty for an entire generation was nearly unrecognizable to the industry that had created her. Gia's bookings had all but vanished. Friends who had once fought to be in her orbit now avoided her calls, weary of broken promises and desperate pleas for money. She moved back to Philadelphia, far from the glamour of New York. Her days consumed by the cycle of addiction and brief attempts at recovery. In 1983, she made one last bid to reclaim her career, securing a Vogue cover shoot with Scavollo. The images were haunting, the bone structure still perfect, but her eyes heavy with something unspoken, as if she already knew the end was near. Not long after. Her family at her side but the fashion world largely silent. In death, Gia became something the industry hadn't allowed her to be in life, human. She was no longer just the untouchable beauty on a magazine cover, but a cautionary tale of what happens when fame collides with fragility. Today, her story lingers not in the glitter of the runway, but in the quiet warning it leaves behind. Even the brightest stars burn out when the world forgets to shield them from the dark.